You are listening to Watchman Internet Radio. I'm your host, Robert King. It's January 13. Well, hello everyone. I didn't get a program out on Saturday due to logistical, technical problems I won't go into, but I did have some thoughts in mind based upon Saturday's daily text. I won't read the text except it was taken from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, where Paul referred to those who will be disobedient to parents. And this is one of the signatures of the last days. In context, the apostle wrote, "But know this, that in the last days, critical times hard to deal with will be here. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal," on and on and on. And we see this on a daily basis. We see it throughout society. We see it perhaps in ourselves and people that we have to deal with. But the point I want to talk about is what Paul was saying in the last days. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses, without question, believe that the last days began in 1914. The time of the end, the final part of the days, the conclusion of the system. There's a number of expressions. And I know I speak about this quite regularly, but then so does the Watchtower, as is demonstrated by their daily text on Saturday. But what I would like to point out is that no matter how many times Jehovah's Witnesses may read this passage, they seem to overlook one important aspect. And that is, the apostle did not say that men will become lovers of themselves during the last days, or men will become lovers of money during the last days. No, read it carefully, my friends. Paul said, "But know this, that in the last days, critical times hard to deal with will be here, for men will be lovers of themselves." So it's not a process that Paul is talking about. I mean, for those of us who've been around a while, if you've lived 40, 50, 60 years, 70 years, you have seen quite a transformation in society. You have seen people become more and more caught up in themselves. But all these things that the apostle spoke about. We've seen people become that more and more and more. This is the age of narcissism. Lovers, extreme lovers of themselves. That's what a narcissist is. And it used to be, fairly rare that a person would have that defect. But now it's like the most common characteristic, it would seem. But the point I want to make is that the last days will be critical times hard to deal with because people will be so ungodly. And that's something that Jehovah's Witnesses do not take into consideration. It's sort of a mind conditioning. Oh, we're in the last days because, look, see, people are becoming more and more. I hope I make a point without belaboring it too much. But this whole notion that we've been in the last days for over a century, these terms sort of lose their meaning. Last days, how about last decades or we're going into the second century of the last days. What's the point? Shouldn't something be ending if we talk about the time of the end or the final part of the days? Instead, it's generation after generation. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say that you're a teenager and you're just starting off in life and you develop some illness and you go to the doctor and they confront you with some very bad news that you have an inoperable form of cancer and you should really get your affairs in order because it's terminal and you don't have long to live. Well, you carry on, you go about your life, you get a career, you marry, you have children. You may go to the doctor and he said, yep, it's terminal. You don't have long to live. And, your children grow up and they have children. You become a grandparent and, you retire from you get the picture. I mean, you just go on and on and on in this terminal state. So was the diagnosis wrong? We'd have to say yes, right? Well, that's sort of the way it is with the Watchtower. We've been in the last days. We've been in the time of the end. Now we're deep into the time of the end. It loses its meaning. Whereas my point of view is that the last days have not begun, that it is at some point in the immediate future, and it is a relatively short period of time. And it will be critical times, hard to deal with, because people are so ungodly. And society, whatever society you're living in, will fracture and not be cohesive. And it will make life very, very difficult for everyone, but especially for those who are different and who stand out as Jehovah's Witnesses do and will, hopefully, in the future. Well, it's interesting that when Paul wrote this to Timothy, he referred to himself as he was in prison, of course, in Rome. And before, like to the Philippians, Paul said that he did not consider himself as having laid hold of the prize of the upward call of Christ. But in his second letter to Timothy, the apostle said that from now on, the reward was reserved for him, that he had won the race. So in that sense, he had been sealed, as will all of those living on earth be sealed and accepted into the kingdom when Christ returns, assuming they pass the test, and some will not. But I think it's interesting that Paul also in that second letter referred to those who love the manifestation of Jesus. Now, I've spoken about this and written about it too, so I hope I'm not belaboring the point, but the manifestation is taken from a Greek word, epiphania. It is interchangeable with other terms in the scriptures, apocalypsis, the revelation of Christ, and the parousia, the presence of Christ. And so those who love his manifestation are those who will see Christ during the last days. Interestingly enough, too, as you read on in that third chapter, after Paul spoke about all these ungodly qualities, then he referred to these two characters, Jannes and Jambres, who opposed Moses. And he indicated that there will be a counterpart of those who oppose the truth during the last days. And he said, such men are completely corrupted in mind, disapproved as regards the faith. And then he says their madness will be plain to all. So Paul was referring to wicked individuals, as he went on to say in verse 13. Wicked men and impostors will advance from bad to worse, misleading and being misled. So obviously there were wicked impostors in the first century. Specifically, Paul called out the superfine apostles in Corinth. They said they were just pretenders whom Satan was using. We can expect the same now and going forward. During the last days, there will be those who come from the truth, men who are assumed to be faithful and discreet, but they'll be apostates and disapproved as regards the faith, and they will oppose Christ as Antichrist, as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. Well, anyway, I want to go ahead and read today's text. Again, not so much the society's comment, but I do repeat myself, but it is because the Watchtower repeats themselves. Am I repeating myself? Yeah. Each one will be like a hiding place from the wind, a place of concealment from the rainstorm, like streams of water in a waterless land, like a shadow of a massive crag in a parched land. So we get the picture in our mind that God will provide a place of refuge from the storm. While the Watchtower applies this to Christian elders. In fact, if you read the context of Isaiah 32, the first verse says, "Look, a king will reign for righteousness, and princes will rule for justice." The Watchtower claims that's Jesus Christ, who began ruling in 1914. We all know that. And princes will rule for justice. Oh, and that's Christian elders? We could speak a long, long time about the injustices that have been perpetrated by Christian elders following the counsel of the Watchtower's lawyers in child abuse cases. And other instances as well. I think baptizing young people and then disfellowshipping them is a horrible crime. So where's the justice? And why is it that God would refer to elders as princes? A prince is a son of a king. So are elders sons of Jesus? He's the king and they are his spiritual sons? I don't think so. That's not to say elders are not serving as Christian overseers. I don't oppose that at all. And I think elders can be helpful. But they're not fulfilling this prophecy. And that can be demonstrated fairly easily if we use our minds to reason correctly. For one thing, in the 8th chapter of Daniel, it refers to the prince of the army and then the prince of princes who will stand up and destroy this king fierce in countenance. Well, the Watchtower claims that the prince is Jehovah himself, which is, I believe, absurd. As I said, a prince is a son of a king, but some of the geniuses at Bethel think otherwise. It doesn't make sense because all of the prophecies in Daniel, they end the same way, with either the Son of Man coming or Michael, the great prince, standing up, destroying God's enemies. The kingdom coming and crushing the image, so on and so forth. It's all Jesus Christ. And doesn't Isaiah refer to Jesus as the Prince of Peace? How is it that Jehovah is a prince? No. The princes who will rule for justice are the brothers of Christ. Christ is the Prince of Princes. He's the King of kings, Lord of lords, and Prince of princes. And his princes are those who are anointed, and at the time when they are received into the kingdom, as Paul said to Timothy, that he had been approved and the crown was his. He had fought the fine fight to the end and he'd won. And so that will be the case with those who are on earth when Christ comes and they receive his approval. They will begin to rule as princes for justice. Doesn't mean they'll be sitting on a throne, and far from it. Paul, if you recall, in his letter to Timothy, he was in prison. And Jesus said many of his brothers will be in prison. The sheep and the goats will be judged as to whether they visited Jesus' brothers while they were in prison. Well, how can they be a hiding place from the wind and a concealment from the rainstorm? Well, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, because the manifestation of Christ will be a very, very powerful thing. And those who see this manifestation will themselves become transformed and manifest themselves. That's what the revealing of the sons of God is about. And that's why in that third verse it goes on to say, then the eyes of those seeing will no longer be pasted shut, and the ears of those hearing will pay attention. Well, the Watchtower and Jehovah's Witnesses assume that the eyes of the blind are opened by reading Bible-based publications, whereas we used to believe that the soul was immortal. Our eyes are open to the fact that it is mortal. We used to believe that God was a Trinity. We used to believe that hell was a fiery place where people were tortured forever. Now our eyes are open. Well, that's not what this prophecy is talking about. People have been reading Bible-based publications since the Watchtower began publishing, and their eyes have been open to these things. But this prophecy is talking about something that occurs in a moment. Then the eyes of those seeing will no longer be pasted shut. So it will be a brilliant flash of light, an eye-opening affair. Right now, Jehovah's concealing matters, and that allows the apostates to have their say, to gain influence among Jehovah's people. God allows it. It's interesting. The next few verses speak about this very thing. The senseless one will no longer be called generous, and the senseless one will speak nonsense, and his heart will devise harmful things to promote apostasy and to speak what is wayward against Jehovah. Isn't that what Paul was talking about to Timothy? Jannes and Jambres oppose Moses, so there will be those who oppose Christ. And they're not people on the outside. The Watchtower labels ex-Jehovah's Witnesses as apostate. Well, apostasy always comes from the top down. People that have influence and that speak for Jehovah, or at least claim to. And right now they're called generous and noble. The senseless one will no longer be called generous, and the unprincipled man will not be called noble. But until the king reigns for righteousness, they are called generous and noble. Feeding us with the finest spiritual food and blah, blah, blah. See how that works? You know, there was a talk given a long time ago. Some of you old-timers might remember it. Can you sleep on a windy night? And it tells the story of this farmer who couldn't find anyone to help him on his farm, and he desperately needed help. So he went to town looking for someone, and he couldn't find anyone. But he came upon this awkward-looking fellow, and he asked him if he would be willing to come out and work on his farm. And the young man said, "I can sleep on a windy night." Well, the man thought that was kind of strange, but okay, you're hired because I need some help. And the young man did a great job. But the only thing that we'd ever say, I can sleep on a windy night. Okay, well, maybe he's got some psychological problems. I don't know. But he's a good worker. But one evening, the sky grew dark and a storm wind was beginning to blow. And the farmer became quite panicked. He ran out to wake up his farmhand, but he couldn't rouse him. He shook him, and the man was just sound asleep. And the farmer was furious. He swore that he was going to fire this man in the morning. And so he went around to secure the barn door, but he found that it had already been shut. He went to put a tarp over his hay, and he found that it already had been secured. And he went to get his cows and other livestock into a secure place, and he found that it had already all been taken care of. And then he remembered the peculiar saying of this young man, I can sleep on a windy night. And then it all made sense to him that the young man had made preparations. He saw the storm coming in advance, and that's why he could sleep on a windy night. Well, the Watchtower uses that as an illustration that we need to do things now not so we can sleep through the tribulation, but so that we may be prepared. Well, my point is, and my point of even reciting this illustration, the storm hasn't come yet. The wind hasn't begun to blow. The rainstorm has not begun. So go back to Isaiah 32:2, and each one will be a hiding place from the wind, a place of concealment from the rainstorm, like streams of water in a waterless land, so on. So how can the elders be this place of refuge from the wind and from the rainstorm if the storm has not begun yet? So we can see that the Watchtower's interpretation has a few holes in it. My point is, the storm is coming. If you go back, Isaiah is all one unified book. And if you go back just a few chapters, God speaks about those who are leading his people, but they're drunk. The priest and the prophet go astray because of alcohol. The wine confuses them, and they stagger from their alcohol. Their vision makes them go astray, and they stumble in judgment. Well, he's not talking about literal alcohol, of course, and we're not talking about the clergy who believe all this nonsensical Babylonian stuff. We're talking about men who know the truth, and because of the power that gives them, it is as if they are drunk. And they're tied to this vision that Christ began ruling in 1914, and they have concealed themselves in this idea that they have God's approval. And God addresses them as this boasters, you rulers of this people in Jerusalem. And as I pointed out before, Jerusalem is a symbol for Christ's congregation. Christianity began in Jerusalem. Christ died outside of Jerusalem. And guess what? Jesus is returning to Jerusalem. Symbolic. Not literally. The evangelicals believe Jesus is going to touch down on the Mount of Olives, literally. That's nonsense. Those are symbols. That's prophecy. Jesus is returning to inspect his congregation. But there are those within Jerusalem who have made a covenant with death. And they say that they've made an agreement with the grave. And when the flash flood passes through, it will not reach us. We have made a lie our refuge, and we've hidden ourselves in falsehood. Well, this will be the situation when Jesus returns in his kingdom power. How do we know that to be true? The very next verse. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says. Hear, I am laying as a foundation in Zion a tested stone, the precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. No one exercising faith will panic. The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will flood out their hiding place. Your covenant with death will be dissolved, and your agreement with the grave will not stand. When the raging flood passes through, you will be crushed by it. As often as it passes through, it will sweep you away. Only terror will make them understand what was heard. How true that is. There is no earthly power, no amount of reasoning can convince anyone on the governing body or the hierarchy at Bethel that Jesus did not begin ruling in 1914 and they're not sitting on the pinnacle of the mountain of Jehovah. But when the flood comes, when the wind blows and the rain pours down, it will become obvious that they were wrong. And in that way, the hail will sweep away their refuge of lies. They'll either have to put trust in Christ and admit they're wrong, or that will be it for them. But it's going to require terror for them to understand. And that terror will come in the form of world war and great tribulation. Didn't Jesus say that Jerusalem will be surrounded and desolated? Jerusalem representing his congregation. Well, thank you for listening. And I hope you can sleep on a windy night.